The day I took back the land everyone said I'd lost forever, my stepfamily stood across the courtroom staring at me like they'd seen a ghost. My stepmother's face had gone completely white. One of her sons kept loosening his tie every few seconds, and the other wouldn't even look in my direction. The judge signed a stack of papers, slid them forward, and just like that, everything changed. 2 years earlier, they had taken my inheritance. Now they were about to lose far more than they had ever stolen. But to understand how any of that happened, you need to know about my father, the farm, and the mistake my stepfamily made when they assumed patience was the same thing as weakness. My name is Ethan Walker, and I grew up outside a small farming town in southern Missouri where everybody knew everybody, where news traveled faster than the mailman, and where my family had worked the same piece of ground for longer than most people could remember. The farm wasn't some giant corporate operation. We had about 50 acres, a weathered farmhouse, a couple of barns, some old tractors that always seemed to need repairs, and fields that my father loved more than just about anything in the world. Some kids grew up playing baseball. I grew up riding beside my dad in a tractor cab while he explained soil conditions like they were the most fascinating thing on earth. Looking back, I realized he wasn't really teaching me about farming. He was teaching me responsibility, patience, and what it meant to leave something better than you found it. My mother passed away when I was young, and for a long time it was just me and Dad. Then he married a woman named Linda Mercer. Linda came with 2 teenage sons, Grant and Tyler. On the surface, we were a blended family. In reality, we were more like people sharing the same address. Linda was always polite when Dad was around, always smiling, always acting supportive, but there was something underneath it that never felt genuine. The older I got, the more obvious it became that she viewed the farm differently than my father did. To Dad, the land was family history. To Linda, it was an asset, a number on paper, something that could eventually be converted into money. Dad and I never talked much about inheritance because honestly I never cared about that part. I cared about the farm because it was home. Still, every now and then, usually after a long day in the fields, Dad would look across the property and say something like, "One day this place will be yours, son. Just promise me you'll take care of it." And I'd laugh and tell him he planned on living forever. The problem with life is that it doesn't care about your plans. Dad got sick unexpectedly. What started as fatigue turned into doctor's appointments, then treatments, then long stretches in hospitals. Within a year, he was gone. I wish I could tell you I handled it well. I didn't. Losing him felt like somebody ripped the foundation out from underneath my life. For weeks I moved through each day in a fog. Then came the reading of the will. I walked into a law office expecting sadness, maybe some awkward family conversations, but nothing more. Instead, I walked into what felt like an ambush. Linda was already there wearing a tailored navy suit I'd never seen before. Grant and Tyler sat beside her looking strangely confident. They weren't grieving. They looked excited. That should have been my first warning. The attorney began reading documents, and within minutes I realized something was very wrong. There was a revised will, supposedly signed only months before my father's death. According to this new document, Linda inherited virtually everything. The house, the farm, the equipment, the accounts. Grant and Tyler would eventually share ownership interests. And me? I received a small cash distribution that wouldn't even cover a year of rent in the city. I honestly thought there had been some mistake. I remember leaning forward and saying, "That can't be right. My dad would never do that." The room got very quiet. Then Linda folded her hands and gave me this little smile I'd never forgotten. Not a happy smile. Not a sympathetic smile. The kind of smile somebody gives when they're enjoying your confusion. The attorney started explaining legal procedures. Signature verification. Witnesses. Documentation. Probates. Terminology designed to make ordinary people feel small. I asked to see every page. I questioned dates. I questioned signatures. I questioned circumstances. Grant actually laughed. "Come on, Ethan," he said. "It's done. You lost. Move on." Tyler leaned back in his chair and added, "It's business. Don't make it emotional. Business." I can still hear those words. My father's entire life reduced to business. I left that office carrying a thin envelope and a level of anger I'd never experienced before. But anger wasn't the worst part. The worst part was doubt. What if nobody would ever believe me? What if the paperwork really was untouchable? What if the people responsible had been careful enough to cover every track? Over the next few months, I fought where I could, asked questions, hired a lawyer I could barely afford, and got nowhere. Every door seemed to close. Every answer led to another dead end. Eventually, my money ran out. My options ran out. And for the first time in my life, I left the farm. I moved into a tiny apartment above a laundromat in St. Louis where the washing machines rattled half the night and the smell of detergent drifted through the floorboards. It felt like a different planet from the life I'd known. Friends back home assumed I'd been beaten. Maybe Linda and her sons assumed the same thing. Maybe they thought time would erase what happened. Maybe they thought I'd forget. The truth was much simpler. I wasn't forgetting anything. I was waiting. And without realizing it, they were already building the thing that would eventually destroy them. The truth was much simpler. I wasn't forgetting anything. I was waiting. And without realizing it, they were already building the thing that would eventually destroy them. At first, my new life felt like punishment. I spent my days working for a land surveying and title research firm, the kind of place most people never think about until they're buying property or fighting over it. The pay wasn't impressive. The office coffee tasted like burnt dirt, and most of my work involved sorting through records that nobody else wanted to look at. But after a while, I started realizing something. Land leaves footprints. Every sale, every permit, every easement, every zoning request, every environmental assessment, every lien, every tax filing. Somewhere, somebody records it. And if you're patient enough, those records start telling stories. Most people look at paperwork and see boredom. I started seeing motives, patterns, mistakes. About 18 months after leaving the farm, I stumbled across something that made me sit up straight in my chair. It was a development proposal filed under a company I'd never heard of. The project was called Meadow Ridge Estates. The proposed site covered several dozen acres outside my hometown. At first, it didn't register. Then I looked at the parcel numbers. My stomach dropped. It was my father's land, or what used to be my father's land. Linda and the boys weren't farming anymore. They weren't preserving anything. They were trying to turn the entire property into a luxury housing development. Hundreds of homes, artificial ponds, walking trails, clubhouses, marketing brochures full of smiling families standing on ground they knew nothing about. I remember staring at the screen and laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was so predictable. The one thing my father loved most was the first thing they wanted to destroy. But what really caught my attention wasn't the project itself. It was how they were paying for it. Public filings showed massive loans, construction financing, investor money, private lending agreements. They had leveraged nearly everything they owned. The farm wasn't just part of the project. It was collateral. If the project failed, everything collapsed with it. That's when I started digging deeper. Most people knew the land as farmland, but I knew every corner of it. I knew where deer bedded down during winter. I knew where the creek flooded after heavy rain. I knew where my father refused to clear trees because certain birds nested there every spring. I knew where old stone foundations sat hidden beneath brush from families that had settled the area generations earlier. Growing up, I thought Dad was just sentimental. As an adult, I started realizing he had been protecting things. Important things. Things that developers hate discovering after they've borrowed millions of dollars. Every evening after work, I started researching. One night turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. I dug through environmental databases, historical archives, conservation maps, county records, state wildlife reports, old aerial photographs, federal land surveys. The deeper I went, the more unbelievable it became. Protected wetlands, multiple sensitive habitats, historical settlement markers, water drainage restrictions, endangered species migration routes. It was like finding layers of dynamite buried underneath a construction site. The shocking part wasn't that these issues existed. The shocking part was that Linda and her sons either didn't know or didn't care. Maybe they thought money solved everything. Maybe consultants told them what they wanted to hear. Either way, they had built their entire financial future on land that was far more complicated than it appeared. One evening, I drove back home for the first time in months. I parked near the old property line and walked through the woods as the sun was setting. Everything looked familiar. The same creek, the same trees, the same silence. I found myself standing near a section of wetland where my father used to bring me when I was a kid. I could practically hear his voice. Some things matter more than money, Ethan. Back then I thought he was talking about nature. Years later I realized he was talking about character. That's when the plan finally came together. I wasn't going to fight them directly. Direct fights are predictable. People prepare for lawsuits. They prepare for arguments. They prepare for confrontations. What they never prepare for is the truth showing up from a dozen different directions at the same time. So I started building a file. Not a complaint. Not a lawsuit. A complete record. Photographs. Reports. Species documentation. Historical records. Environmental restrictions. Maps. Survey data. Government references. Every fact carefully sourced. Every claim backed by evidence. I treated it like I was preparing the most important project of my life. Because I was. Then I started sending information. Quietly. An environmental review board received a package. A local conservation group received another. A historical preservation society got one too. Then a regional newspaper. Then a journalist known for investigating development scandals. Nobody knew the information came from me. I made sure of that. The reaction happened faster than I expected. Within weeks, questions started appearing. Then investigations. Then public meetings. Reporters began asking uncomfortable questions. Environmental organizations started demanding additional studies. Historical experts requested site evaluations. Government agencies delayed approvals pending further review. Suddenly, Meadow Ridge Estates wasn't a promising development anymore. It was a controversial development. Investors hate controversy. Lenders hate uncertainty. And developers absolutely hate delays when they're making loan payments every month. I watched everything unfold from a distance. The first investor group withdrew support. Then another. Construction schedules slipped. Additional environmental reviews were ordered. Costs increased. Deadlines passed. The local paper ran a story questioning whether the project should have been approved at all. Then came television coverage. Not national coverage. Small-town regional coverage. The kind that's actually worse because everyone involved has to face their neighbors afterward. Meanwhile, Linda and the boys were spending money like people trying to stop a flood with a bucket. Consultants. Attorneys. Specialists. Public relations firms. More consultants. More attorneys. Every solution cost money. Every delay cost money. Every month the debt grew larger. Through industry contacts, I occasionally heard rumors. Investors were nervous. Contractors wanted assurances. Lenders were demanding answers. Pressure was building from every direction. Then one afternoon, I came across something even more interesting than the environmental issues. The primary lender had begun internally classifying portions of the project as distressed debt. I probably stared at that document for 10 minutes. Distressed debt. That phrase changed everything. Because up until that moment, my plan had been revenge. Suddenly, an entirely different possibility appeared. Opportunity. I spent weeks researching financial acquisitions, loan purchases, debt restructuring, foreclosure law. The more I learned, the more obvious the path became. Linda and her sons didn't actually own their future anymore. The bank did. And banks are not sentimental. Banks don't care about family drama. Banks care about recovering money. Several months later, I arranged a meeting. Not as Ethan Walker, grieving son. Not as the guy who had lost the farm. I walked in as a private investor interested in acquiring distressed assets. The executives looked exhausted. They'd spent years trying to salvage a failing project. I presented a proposal. Professional. Calm. Simple. I offered to purchase the debt portfolio at a steep discount. One executive actually asked why I would want such a mess. I smiled and said, sometimes value is hiding underneath bad management. He laughed. If only he knew. Negotiations took weeks. Then one morning the deal closed. Just like that, I became the holder of the debt secured by my father's former property. I remember sitting alone in my apartment staring at the final paperwork. For 2 years I had felt powerless. For 2 years I had watched other people profit from what they had taken. Now the situation had completely reversed. They just didn't know it yet. The first missed payment arrived a few months later. Then another. Their development was stalled. Investors were disappearing. Revenue wasn't coming in. The numbers no longer worked. Legally, I gave them every notice required under the agreement. Every deadline. Every opportunity. Everything by the book. No tricks. No shortcuts. No favors either. Then came the final default notice. The moment I signed those papers, I knew there was no turning back. The machine they had built through greed was finally collapsing under its own weight. And soon all of us would be standing in the same courthouse where the final chapter of this story would begin. The machine they had built through greed was finally collapsing under its own weight. And soon all of us would be standing in the same courthouse where the final chapter of this story would begin. The hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of gray Missouri day where the sky feels heavy enough to touch. I arrived early and sat quietly in the back of the courtroom. Nobody recognized me at first. That alone was strange. For most of my life, I had been the farmer's son, the kid everyone knew. But 2 years had changed me. I wasn't carrying anger anymore. At least not the kind that keeps you awake at night. What I carried now was certainty. About 20 minutes before the hearing started, Linda walked in with Grant and Tyler. The confidence they used to wear like armor was gone. Their expensive suits looked sharp, but exhaustion has a way of showing through fabric. Grant spotted me first. His eyes widened. Tyler followed his gaze. Then Linda turned around. For a second, nobody spoke. She looked confused, then suspicious, then worried. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The hearing itself was surprisingly short. That's the funny thing about legal battles. Movies make them look dramatic. Real life usually comes down to paperwork. Documents either support you or they don't. Facts either exist or they don't. The judge reviewed the loan agreements, the payment history, the notices of default, the foreclosure filings, and every supporting document. Everything was clean. Everything was legal. Everything had been done exactly as required. Linda's attorney argued for additional time. The judge asked on what basis. The attorney shuffled papers, offered explanations, mentioned market conditions and project delays. The judge listened patiently and then asked the only question that really mattered. Were the payments made? Silence. The attorney lowered his eyes. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. That was essentially the end of it. A few minutes later, the ruling was entered. Foreclosure approved. Ownership transferred according to the terms of the debt agreement. Just like that, the land came back. Not through revenge. Not through some secret loophole. Through the same legal system they had relied on when they took it from me in the first place. That's when Linda finally realized who had acquired the debt. She stared at me as if she couldn't process what she was hearing. You, she whispered. You did this. I stood up slowly. No, Linda, I said. You did. Tyler exploded first. He started shouting about sabotage, conspiracies, unfair treatment. Grant threatened lawsuits. Threatened investigations. Threatened everything except taking responsibility. The judge immediately shut it down. Their attorney looked like a man who desperately wanted to be somewhere else. As deputies moved everyone toward the exit, Linda remained frozen in place. For the first time since my father's death, she looked genuinely defeated. Not angry, not arrogant, just defeated. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already waiting. The development controversy had generated enough attention that local media wanted updates. Cameras turned toward Linda and her sons. Questions started flying. Questions about wetlands. Questions about permits. Questions about investors. Questions about environmental reviews. Nobody wanted to hear their answers anymore. The story had already been written in the public's mind. Over the following months, the fallout continued spreading. Investors who had lost money wanted explanations. Business partners distanced themselves. Future projects disappeared. Their names became associated with one of the most visible development failures the region had seen in years. I didn't have to do anything else. Momentum handled the rest. The strange part is that none of that became the most satisfying moment. People always assume revenge feels best when your enemies lose. For me, the best moment happened weeks later. I drove back to the farm alone. No lawyers. No reporters. No celebration. Just me. The property looked different than I remembered. Maybe because I was seeing it through older eyes. I walked through the fields where my father and I had spent countless mornings fixing fences and checking crops. I crossed the creek where we'd fished together when I was a kid. Eventually, I made my way to the wetland area that had caused so many problems for the development project. The sun was beginning to set. The water reflected orange light across the reeds. Everything was quiet. Standing there, I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. My father never left me the farm because it was valuable. He left it to me because I understood why it mattered when someone assumed inheritance. The knowledge was. The patience was. The respect for things that can't be measured on a balance sheet was. Linda and her son saw acreage. My father saw a legacy. That's why they lost, and why I eventually won. Not because I was smarter. Not because I was luckier. Because I valued something they never understood. A few months after regaining the property, I placed most of the environmentally sensitive sections into conservation protection so nobody could ever try the same thing again. Some neighbors thought I was crazy. Others thought I was noble. Honestly, I didn't care. I slept better than I had in years. Now here's the part that still sparks arguments whenever people hear this story. Some folks say I should have forgiven them and moved on. Others say I should have fought even harder and gone after every dollar they had left. Personally, I think life already delivered the lesson better than I ever could. They spent years trying to take something that wasn't truly theirs, and in the process they lost the very thing they were chasing. So maybe the real question isn't whether what I did was right or wrong. Maybe the real question is this. If someone manipulated the system to take away your family's legacy, and years later you had a legal opportunity to take it back, would you do exactly what I did, or would you walk away and start over somewhere else? Let me know down in the comments because I've heard passionate arguments from both sides, and honestly, I'm still fascinated by how differently people see justice. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Was this justice, revenge, or something in between? I'd love to hear your perspective.